May 1852. Charleston was already sweating before the sun fully cleared the rooftops, and the auction yard smelled like hot wood, damp rope, cheap tobacco, and fear that no soap could scrub out. They lined us up in a row they called defective, as if the word itself could make our bodies smaller, and I stood there with my hands folded the way I'd learned to keep them still, harmless, easy to ignore, while flies found the corners of my mouth, and no one bothered to swat them away for me. I couldn't see the crowd, not the men with their fine coats, or the women with their parasols, or the boys craning their necks to stare at the broken ones, but I heard them clearly, the low chuckles, the bored sighs, the scrape of boots on packed dirt, the little clicks of coin against coin when a man decided he might buy a body the way he'd buy a tool. The auctioneer's voice came sharp and bright, like a knife being tapped on a table. "Blind female, 30 years of age," he said, drawing out the words so the crowd could taste the contempt in them. "Can perform simple kitchen tasks under supervision. Completely docile." That word used to make my stomach clench, because it meant they believed I had no teeth. "Do I hear $1? Silence, then a laugh somewhere to my left, one of those short laughs men give when they're pleased with themselves for having no pity. 50 cents, more silence. 25 cents. "Someone take her off my hands. My name is Esther." And I had been blind since the moment I drew my first breath in 1822 on a tobacco plantation in the Piedmont of North Carolina. But I had learned early that blindness didn't mean darkness was empty. Darkness was full, thick with sound and scent and texture. And if you were quiet enough, if you listened the way your life depended on it, you could learn more than people who thought seeing was the only way to know. Still, on that block in Charleston, with sweat rolling down the line of my spine and the air buzzing with impatience, I knew I was exactly what they said, worthless to them. The auctioneer was already turning his attention to the next person when a hand went up in the crowd with a lazy, dismissive motion, like shooing a fly. "Sold," the auctioneer snapped. And the hammer fell. 25 cents. Less than a decent meal, less than a pair of gloves, less than a cheap bottle of whiskey. I heard the coin land in the auctioneer's palm, heard the faint ring that meant silver, and then the shuffle as someone came closer to claim what he had bought. The man did not speak to me at first. He didn't need to. He had paid, and in Charleston in 1852, that was all the conversation required. But I caught him the way I catch everyone through what he couldn't help giving away. His footsteps were measured, not rushed, the heel striking first with confidence, the toe following like an afterthought. His breathing was calm, the breathing of a man used to being obeyed. When he passed close enough, I smelled him. Expensive cologne layered over clean wool and something darker tobacco that had lived in the fabric, and under that, faint and sharp, a medicinal edge that pricked at my nose. It might have been nothing. It might have been the apothecary clinging to his fingers from some tonic, some powder, some household necessity. In my world, might be nothing was a category I never threw away. It was where danger liked to hide. "Come, a younger voice," said one of his slaves, lightly taking my elbow, careful but not kind, guiding me down from the block. My feet found the ground. The yard noises shifted behind us. Another body up on the platform. Another voice describing defects, like livestock. Another bargain being struck. As we moved, I forced my face into the blank expression that had kept me alive across 7 owners and 4 states. People think a blind woman's face is honest because it's not watching them. But my face learned to lie before my mouth ever did. We reached a carriage. I felt the edge of the step, the smooth wood, the warm leather inside, and I sat where they placed me. The Mung Josiah Caldwell. I would learn climbed in with the ease of someone who has never doubted he belonged anywhere. The door shut, trapping heat and scent and the cramped space of strangers. The carriage lurched forward. Charleston street spoke to me through vibration, cobblestones rattling the wheels, the hollow echo when we passed under a covered walkway, the sudden quiet when we turned onto a smoother stretch. I kept my hands folded, but my mind was moving, fast, building a map from scraps. How long we traveled, how many turns, the distance between one set of bells and another. The way the air changed when we neared the harbor and then changed again as we moved away. Caldwell never said a word. He didn't need to reassure himself about me. He had already decided what I was: harmless, helpless, cheap. When we stopped, the air smelled different: beeswax, flowers, clean stone warmed by sun. The door opened, and a wall of sound rose. Multiple voices in a house that held people like pieces on a board. A butler's deeper tone, a woman's lighter steps above us, a kitchen's constant life somewhere in the backwood crackling, water poured, metal clinking. Master Caldwell. Someone said, respectful, practiced. Caldwell replied with a grunt that meant yes, I'm home, keep the world in order. They led me inside, and the house announced itself through its floor's polished hardwood that gave a crisp report to every footstep. The kind of floor meant to reflect wealth even if I could never see it shine. My guide's hand stayed on my arm. I let him guide me, not because I needed it, not always, but because people liked me better when I needed it. In the kitchen, heat wrapped around me from a large hearth. The air was thick with onions and salt pork and bread rising somewhere nearby. A woman's voice cut through the bustle, older, sharp with authority. So this is her, she said. Blind, the word came out like a tool being tested for weakness. Name: Esther, I answered softly. Aunt Bess, she said, and there was a pause as she took me in with eyes I couldn't see. I could hear skepticism in the tightness of her breath. Can you work? Or are you going to be trouble? Trouble. That was what they called any need, any limit, any delay. I can work, I said. I've worked in kitchens before. We'll see, she replied. You sit there by the hearth, peel what I give you. Wash what I tell you. Don't wander. Don't touch the mistress's china. If you break something, Master Caldwell will take it out of all of us. The way she said all of us told me she understood the chain. One mistake from the bottom became punishment down the line. She put a basin in front of me, then a pile of potatoes. I took a knife and began to peel. The motion so familiar, my hands didn't need thought. While my hands worked, my ears and nose did what they always did. They learned. Aunt Bess moved like someone who had walked the same routes for decades. I could track her by the drag of her shoe near the hearth, by the shift in her breathing when she leaned into a heavy pot, by the way her voice rose when she barked an order and fell when she muttered a complaint to herself. To younger women, Sarah and Mary, I would learn whispered whenever Aunt Bess's back was turned. Their whispers were not quiet to me. Nothing was quiet to me if I made myself listen. He bought her for a quarter. One breathed, and the other made a small sound that was half pity, half disbelief. Why would he do that? He came late, the first said. All the good ones gone. Master don't like to leave empty-handed. Their words slid into my mind and took a place there. That first afternoon, I learned the house's rhythm. The butler Samuel moving through the front rooms with measured dignity. The maids upstairs quick and careful. A stable hand out back. A gardener in the yard. And I learned a soft, fragile pattern of footsteps on the second floor. The mistress, Catherine Caldwell, they called her, but no one said it loudly, and no one said it with warmth. She moved rarely. When she did, her steps were slow, as if each one cost her. There was a smell too, faint at first, a sourness and a lavender that made the back of my throat tighten. Sickness, not the sharp fever sense that comes and goes, but something persistent. Like the body had been losing an argument for a long time. I had smelled sickness on plantations before consumption. Long rot, infections from cuts that wouldn't heal. This was different. This was inside, deep, hidden. The first week passed. Then the second. I did what I was told and did it. Well, People stopped watching my hands and started forgetting I was there, which was the best kind of safety. It gave me space to notice what they didn't guard. Caldwell's temper came through the house like weather. You could feel it before he arrived. Footsteps hard, quick, then doors opening too sharply. Then voices tightening. His voice was controlled when strangers were present, but in the house it dropped into something rougher, a sound like a fist closing. "Where is it?" he would demand, and slaves would answer too fast, too eager, because slowness was what earned pain. At night, when the kitchen quieted and Aunt Bess finally sat, I heard things from farther away. Caldwell moving upstairs at unusual times, the maid's anxious breathing as she stood outside the mistress's room, the doctor's visits growing more frequent. Dr. Harrison had a brisk, professional gait. He smelled of soap and ink and herbs, the way men who handle remedies often do. His voice carried confidence until he talked about Catherine. Then it grew careful, uncertain, wasting. I heard him say one afternoon through a half-closed door, his words traveling down a hallway and around a corner like water finding gaps. "Stomach pains, nausea, weakness," Caldwell answered with perfect concern, the kind of concern a man performs the way he performs charity at church. "Is there nothing to be done?" he asked. And I could hear the small lift at the end of his sentence, not grief anticipation. I told myself I might be wrong. I told myself I was hearing what I expected to hear, because I had lived too long among men who could not stand women being in convent. Sick, childless. But I listened anyway, because being wrong never killed me. Being careless did. Then, 2 weeks after I arrived, Caldwell brought down a tray himself. That was the first thing that made my fingers pause on a potato skin. He wasn't the kind of man who carried dishes. Men like him had other hands for that. He crossed the kitchen with the tray held steady, his steps careful, almost deliberate. As if he didn't want to slosh whatever was in the bowl. Aunt Bess straightened the moment she sensed him. Sarah went still. Even the hearth seemed to quiet. Caldwell didn't look in my direction, but his presence filled the room anyway. He set the tray near the scullery without a word and turned to leave. As he passed close to my corner, a scent rose up beneath the beef broth and bread and sweet tea, faint, fleeting, but sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Bitter almonds. So faint I almost doubted myself. In the same instant, my mind flicked back years to a barn in North Carolina, where rat poison had been laid in the corners and an old man had warned us not to touch it. And I had leaned too close and caught that same strange edge in the air. Bitter. Almonds. Arsenic. Not always. Not to everyone. People argued about whether it had a smell at all, but I had smelled it once. And now something in me insisted I was smelling it again. My hands kept moving because they had to. I let the knife scrape and peel as if nothing had happened. But inside my chest my heart started beating too hard, too loud. I was not certain. I want to say I was, because certainty sounds strong, but strength was not what kept you alive in a place like that. Survival was precision. So I tested my own senses the only way I could without giving myself away. I breathed shallow, then deeper, as Caldwell's cologne and wool shifted away. The bitter almond edge lingered a moment, then vanished under the kitchen's heavier smells. Maybe it was from his hands. Maybe it was from the tray. Maybe it was nothing at all. Some harmless extract in a dessert. Something used in the mistress's medicine. My mind offered me excuses the way it always did, when the truth threatened to pull me into danger. Then Caldwell's footsteps went up the stairs again, and I heard the difference in them, slower than usual, careful, not the stride of a man heading to a meeting, but the measured steps of someone carrying something that must not spill, someone who does not want to be heard. A door opened upstairs. Catherine's weak cough followed, thin as paper, and Caldwell's voice softened in a way that made my skin crawl. Because it wasn't kindness, it was control wearing a gentle mask. I peeled potatoes until my fingers wrinkled from the damp. That night, lying on my pallet near the dying embers of the hearth, I listened to the house settle. I listened to Sarah's quiet sobbing in a corner where she thought no one could hear. I listened to Caldwell's steps again, late, toward the back of the house. Toward rooms men shouldn't enter at that hour, if they were the kind of respectable husbands Charleston liked to pretend they were. Ray. I told myself I had no proof. I told myself I was a blind slave bought for a quarter, and quarters do not accuse men like Josiah Caldwell of murder. But I also told myself something else. Something I had learned from my mother Ruth before she died, exhausted and coughing. When a man believes you cannot see him, he stops hiding. He grows careless in the ways that matter. He starts to think the darkness belongs to him. I lay there, eyes open to nothing, and let the sounds and smells of the Caldwell house fill me until I could map every footstep, every door, every breath. I decided I would watch quietly, patiently, without rushing to conclusions I could not survive. Because if that bitter almond scent returned, if it returned again and again, then maybe would turn into a pattern, and patterns were the only kind of truth the world ever allowed someone like me to hold. By the third week in the Caldwell house, I had learned that time moved differently there, not by clocks but by symptoms and moods. By how often Dr. Harrison's carriage stopped outside, and by how long Catherine stayed in her room, without moving at all. Days thickened, slowed, then snapped back suddenly when Caldwell's temper cut through the house, and I kept my place by the hearth, hands busy, ears open, nose cautious, reminding myself every morning that certainty was a luxury I could not afford. The bitter almond scent did not appear every day, and that unsettled me more than if it had. It came irregularly, faint enough that I sometimes wondered if my mind was filling in gaps, if memory was playing tricks on me because fear wanted a shape. The second time I caught it, it was stronger than the first but still fleeting, riding the steam from a thin broth Catherine barely touched. And when I leaned back on my stool, heart racing, I realized I had been holding my breath, like a child afraid to make a sound in the dark. That night I replayed it again and again, breaking the moment into pieces the way I had learned to do on plantations, when an overseer's mood meant the difference between a warning and a beating. How close Caldwell had passed, how long the scent lingered, whether it clung to his hands or the tray itself, whether anything else in the kitchen could have carried that note. I tested myself the next morning when Aunt Bess sent me to fetch flour from a cupboard where rat poison had once been stored for the pantry mice. I opened the lid slowly and breathed in, searching for the almond edge, and there it was, unmistakable, sharper, harsher, nothing like the faint echo I'd sensed near Catherine's food. The comparison steadied me and frightened me at the same time, because it told me two things could be true at once. I could be right, and I could still be wrong about when and how often. Caldwell did not poison his wife carelessly. If that was what he was doing, he was patient, precise, and that meant every mistake I made in my own judgment could cost me more than I had to lose. Catherine's decline continued in small humiliations the house pretended not to notice. She ate less. She vomited more. Her steps grew uneven, and sometimes she did not rise at all. When she did speak, her voice carried down the stairwell like something fragile being carried too far. It tired quickly, broke apart, and I could hear the effort it took her to ask for water. Caldwell's concern deepened in public and thinned in private. In the parlor with visitors, his voice softened. His questions came gentle and frequent. "How are you feeling today, my dear?" he would ask. And Catherine would answer with the weary honesty of someone who no longer had the strength to pretend. When the visitors left, his voice hardened again, clipped and impatient, and I heard him instruct the maids to keep her room quiet. Keep her fed. Keep her out of sight. Keep her convenient. Sarah began to change in ways that made my stomach knot. She startled more easily. Her breathing went shallow whenever Caldwell entered the kitchen. Some nights she returned from the study with her steps uneven, her scent sharp with fear and shame layered together so thick it almost burned my nose. Once, when Aunt Bess sent her to scrub pots beside me, Sarah's hands shook so badly she dropped one. And when I reached out to steady it, she flinched as if I had struck her. "Don't," she whispered, then caught herself and added, louder, "Sorry." I did not ask questions. Questions were dangerous. But I listened, and the house spoke enough. The bitter almond scent returned a third time, then a fourth, never. Announced, always riding something else: beef broth, weak tea, a custard Catherine barely touched. Each time, I told myself to wait for a pattern, and slowly, reluctantly, one formed. Caldwell carried the tray himself on those days. His steps slowed. His breathing changed. The scent appeared not every meal, not even every day, but often enough that my excuses began to thin. Still, doubt clung to me like damp. There were moments when the smell did not come at all, when Catherine's illness seemed to move forward on its own terrible logic. And I wondered if I had built a story because my life had trained me to expect cruelty. That doubt saved me more than once, because it kept me quiet when fear wanted to shout. It also kept me awake at night, listening to the house breathe, wondering if silence made me complicit in something my hands could never touch. Caldwell grew bolder as Catherine weakened. He stayed out later. He entertained more. Laughter began to return to the parlor, sharp and out of place, like a note struck wrong in a hymn. He talked business with men whose voices carried greed, the way some men carry cologne, discussing land and debt and opportunity in tones that told me his mind was already arranging a future without the woman upstairs. I heard numbers pass between them, sums that made his breathing quicken with anticipation, and I smelled ink and paper when he practiced signatures alone at his desk, scratching and repeating until the rhythm of another man's name lived in his wrist. Dr. Harrison came and went, his visits growing shorter, his recommendations more resigned. "Keep her comfortable," he said more than once, and Caldwell agreed too quickly, as if relief had slipped into the space where worry should have been. One afternoon, after Caldwell had gone upstairs with a tray that carried the bitter almond edge so faint it almost hid itself, Catherine cried out in pain. A sound that cut through the house and left it stunned. The maids rushed. Caldwell followed, at a measured pace that fooled no one who knew how to listen. I stayed where I was, peeling apples, my hands steady, my heart not. When the sounds finally settled, I smelled something else on Caldwell as he came back down, sweat tinged with metal, the scent of adrenaline and relief tangled together. Relief. That was when my doubt began to collapse into something harder and colder. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my pallet and counted Caldwell's steps, counted the times he paused at Sarah's door, counted the ways a man can move through a house when he believes it belongs to him completely. By morning, my hands felt heavy, as if they had been carrying something all night. I made a mistake that day, a small one, but in my world small mistakes were dangerous. Aunt Bess asked me to taste a sauce to see if it needed salt. I leaned too close, breathed in too deeply, searching for something that wasn't there. And my face must have tightened because she snapped, "What's wrong with it?" I shook my head too fast. "Nothing," I said. "Just hot." She watched me for a long moment, then turned away, but the moment stayed with me like a bruise. I realized then how close I was to betraying myself. How easily fear could push me into drawing attention I could not survive. Caldwell noticed things like that. He noticed everything he needed to notice. After that, I forced myself to narrow my focus. I stopped reaching for certainty and settled for accumulation. I counted how often Caldwell bought arsenic at the apothecary, under the excuse of rats on the plantation. How often that excuse appeared in conversation with men who didn't question it because it sounded practical. I listened to Catherine's symptoms and compared them to the illnesses I had known, weighing similarities and differences the way my mother had taught me when sickness swept the quarters and rumors were as deadly as the disease. I told myself, a truth I had avoided. Even if Caldwell was killing his wife, I was not the one who could stop him. Not yet. The law did not hear voices like mine. The law did not trust noses and ears when they belonged to blind slaves. Speaking too soon would not save Catherine. It would only add my body to the list of things Caldwell could discard. That truth tasted bitter, and I hated it, but hating it did not make it less true. Catherine died on a humid night in late August. The house announced it with chaos. Caldwell shouting for help. Feet running, Dr. Harrison's heard arrival. The maid's hushed sobs. I lay still on my pallet and listened to the sound of a life ending without seeing a single thing. By morning, the story had already been written. A long illness. A merciful end. A grieving husband. I smelled something else on Caldwell then. Something that surprised me, not triumph exactly, but release. The loosening of a tension that had been pulled tight for months. At the funeral at St. Michael's Church, the city gathered to perform sorrow. I stood at the back with the other slaves and listened to the minister's words wash over the room like water over stone. Caldwell's voice broke at the right moments. His breathing hitched on cue. If I had not known him the way I did, I might have believed him. After the burial, life in the house shifted quickly. Caldwell's laughter returned in earnest. He spent Catherine's money with an ease that told me he had been waiting to do so. He summoned Sarah more often, his cruelty losing what little caution it had once possessed. And I listened to her cry into a pillow at night, her grief tangled with terror and shame until they were indistinguishable. I told myself again that silence was survival, but the words began to ring hollow, even as they kept me breathing. 6 weeks after Catherine's death, Robert Thornton arrived from Georgia. I knew he was different before anyone told me his name. His steps lacked Caldwell's confidence. They were thoughtful, measured, as if each one asked permission of the ground. His scent carried earth and sweat and something steady beneath a man used to responsibility, but not intoxicated by it. He asked questions. He asked them quietly, without the sharp edge that made slaves clamp their mouths shut. When he asked to speak with each of us alone, Caldwell agreed, but I could hear the tension in his voice, smell the anxiety sweat he tried to hide with cologne. When Robert Thornton sat across from me in the kitchen, dismissing the others, the house seemed to lean in. "Esther," he said, and he waited, the silence deliberate, giving me room I was not used to having. "Did you notice anything unusual about my sister's illness?" My heart hammered so hard I was afraid he would hear it. I thought of all the times doubt had saved me, and all the times silence had cost someone else their life. I told him the truth as carefully as I could, admitting where I had doubted, where I had tested myself, where the pattern had emerged despite my fear. "I did not see it," I said. Because honesty mattered now more than ever. "I smelled it. More than once. And I heard the way your brother-in-law moved when he carried her food." The room held its breath. Robert's breathing changed, quick and sharp. The sound of a man stepping onto ground he had not known was there. "If you are wrong," he said quietly, "this will destroy him." "If I am right," I answered, "it already has." When Robert Thornton left the kitchen that day, he did not promise me anything, and I was grateful for that, because promises have a way of rotting in places where power decides what truth is worth. Instead, he thanked me once, quietly, the way a man thanks someone when he knows the cost of what has just been given, and his footsteps moved away slower than when he had arrived, heavy with decisions he had not expected to carry. For the next few days, the Caldwell house existed in a strange suspension, as if everyone sensed that something unseen had shifted beneath the floors. Caldwell himself grew sharper, more watchful. His voice controlled but brittle, and I felt his attention brush past me more than once like a hand hovering too close to a flame. He did not confront me, not directly. But the questions came sideways: why I had been in the pantry longer than usual, why Sarah looked pale, why the maids were whispering more than they should, and each time I answered simply, truthfully, offering him nothing he could grasp. Silence became heavier after that, not the safe invisibility I had relied on for years, but a charged quiet that made every sound feel like it carried weight. Robert Thornton returned the following week with a lawyer named Samuel Pierce, a man whose voice held the careful patience of someone who listens for a living, and whose footsteps told me he was accustomed to rooms where words mattered more than fists. Pierce asked questions differently from Robert, slower, more precise, and when I spoke to him, I felt the unfamiliar sensation of being believed without being indulged. He did not interrupt when I admitted uncertainty, did not push me to sharpen memories that were already sharp enough to cut, and when I told him about the times the bitter almond scent did not appear, he nodded as if that mattered as much as when it did. Caldwell was not ignorant of these visits. I smelled his anger before I heard it, metallic and hot, and one evening as I scrubbed pots by the hearth, he stopped near my corner and stood there just long enough to let his presence press against me. "You hear a lot for someone who can't see," he said, casually, the words tossed like bait. I kept my hands moving. "Kitchens are loud, sir," I answered. He laughed once, sharp and humorless, and walked away. But that night Sarah did not come back to the kitchen until long after midnight, and when she did, her breathing was broken, her scent raw with fear, and I knew Caldwell was testing his reach, reminding us all of where the danger lived. Pierce began to move quietly through the city, and the house became a place where secrets shifted like furniture being rearranged in the dark. I heard Caldwell arguing with men in the parlor about money and land, his voice tight with irritation. And I heard Pierce's name spoken once in a tone that told me Caldwell was learning how exposed he truly was. Dr. Harrison was summoned again, this time not to tend the living but to explain the dead. And when he spoke of Catherine's symptoms to Pierce and Robert, his voice faltered in places it never had before, as if doubt had finally found a way in. "Chronic poisoning," Pierce said once, testing the words, and the room went still. Caldwell's breathing changed then, just for a moment, and I smelled the sweat that followed fear. Not the fear of guilt discovered, but the fear of control slipping. Within weeks, Pierce petitioned the courts to allow my testimony, and Charleston answered the way Charleston always answered to anything that threatened its order with noise. Newspapers carried the story in careful phrases that pretended neutrality while feeding hunger, a blind slur. The woman, a respected merchant, a shocking accusation. The attention pressed in on the house from every side, and Caldwell responded by tightening his grip. He watched Sarah constantly now, his cruelty becoming reckless, and once, when she stumbled near the back stairs, he struck her so hard the sound cracked through the hall like a gunshot. I heard her fall. I heard Samuel the butler step forward, and then stop himself, the hesitation sharp as a blade. That night, when I lay on my pallet, the old calculations returned, but this time they failed me. Survival by silence had kept me alive for 30 years, but it had also brought us here, to a place where a man believed he could do anything, as long as no one dared to say his name out loud. The preliminary hearing was set for November, and the weeks leading to it stretched thin as wire. Pierce prepared me the way one prepares a witness who is already standing on a cliff. He did not teach me what to say, only how to say it, so that my own honesty would not be twisted against me. "They will try to make you either a miracle or a liar," he told me, his voice steady. "Do not be either." On the day of the hearing, the courthouse smelled of wool coats, ink, and anticipation, and the crowd's presence pressed against my skin like heat. Judge Henry Whitmore's voice carried authority without cruelty, and when he spoke my name, I felt the weight of the room settle on my shoulders. Pierce began with tests meant not to amaze, but to establish trust, and I passed the first, easily identifying people by footsteps, objects by touch, but the fourth test, the one meant to show I could detect deception, nearly broke me. One man spoke a partial truth. His fear mixed with pride in a way that muddied the scent. And when I hesitated, the room leaned forward. "Hungry? I am not certain," I said finally. My voice steady even as my heart pounded. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harrison, Caldwell's lawyer, smiled then, sensing blood. "So you admit you can be wrong," he said smoothly. "Yes," I answered, because the truth mattered more than victory. "I can." The pause that followed felt endless, but something shifted in it. Certainty had not saved me, but honesty did. Judge Whitmore allowed my testimony, narrowly, and the trial was set. Caldwell's hatred became a living thing after that. I smelled it on him in the halls, heard it in the way his steps quickened when he passed me. And once, late at night, he stopped outside the kitchen where I slept and stood there long enough for me to understand that he was reminding me how easily accidents happened. The trial began in December, and when I took the stand, the courtroom's silence pressed in so hard it was almost physical. Pierce asked his questions simply, letting me tell the story as it was, doubt and all. And when Harrison cross-examined me, he went for the throat. "You waited months," he said. "You watched a woman die and said nothing. How is that not complicity?" The word landed like a blow. I felt it hit every place I had hidden from myself. "I waited because the law did not belong to me," I said, my voice low, "because speaking too soon would not have saved her and would have ended me. I am not proud of the waiting, but I am here now." The jury watched me closely then, not with pity but with calculation. And I knew that whatever happened next would not belong to me anymore. When the verdict came guilty, the room erupted, and Caldwell's breath left him in a sound I will never forget. Part disbelief, part rage, part something like grief for the man he had believed himself to be. They hanged him in February. And I did not go. Freedom came later, granted quietly, without ceremony. And when I left Charleston for Philadelphia, the city's sounds faded behind me, but the smells never did. Even now, years later, there are nights when bitter almonds rise unbidden in my memory, and I lie awake reminding myself that truth, once spoken, does not disappear. It only changes the shape of the silence that follows. The trial did not end. The danger, the way people like to believe stories end danger. It only changed its shape. And in the days after the verdict, before the sentence was carried out, Charleston felt tighter, meaner, as if the city itself resented what had happened, and was deciding who to punish next for allowing it. Caldwell's supporters whispered my name with a kind of venom that traveled through walls. And more than once I heard men argue in taverns about whether a blind slave should have been silenced before he ever reached a courtroom. And I learned then that winning a trial does not mean winning peace. Pierce stayed close during those weeks, his presence a steady thing. But even he could not quiet the undercurrents of anger that followed me through streets I had once moved through and seen. Samuel the butler walked closer to me than he ever had before, his footsteps a quiet shield, and Sarah avoided my touch entirely, not because she blamed me, but because what had been done in that house had burned too deep for gratitude to feel safe. Judge Whitmore issued the sentence with a voice that did not tremble, and when Caldwell was led away, I smelled on him not fear, but a cold, hollow resignation. The scent of a man who has finally run out of places to hide. He did not look at me, not once, and I understood then that what I had taken from him was not only his life but the lie he had told himself about his own cleverness. The day of the hanging arrived wrapped in winter air sharp enough to sting the lungs, and though I did not attend, the city carried it to me anyway in sound and rumor. In the hush that followed and the uneasy relief that settled like dust, some called it justice, others called it a mistake, and a few called it a warning, and all of them were right in their own way. Freedom did not come immediately. It arrived as paper, as signatures, as quiet decisions made in rooms where I was not present. And when Judge Whitmore finally summoned me to hear that I was to be manumitted, his voice carried something like regret alongside resolve. as if he understood that correcting one wrong did not absolve him of the others he lived with. Every day, when I held the papers in my hands, I expected to feel lighter, but what I felt instead was unmoored, as if the ground I had learned to read by sound and memory had shifted without warning. Freedom is a word people say easily, but living it is something else entirely. Robert Thornton pressed money into my hands before I left Charleston, more than I had ever held at one time, and told me it was not payment but thanks. A distinction that mattered to him and to me both, and he wrote letters to contacts in Philadelphia, who would not turn me away simply because I had been born into chains. The journey north was the first time I chose where my body would go, and that choice carried fear with it. Every unfamiliar sound on the ship made my heart race. Every new scent had to be catalogued quickly, because for the first time I could not rely on the rigid patterns of captivity to tell me where safe it. While Philadelphia announced itself differently from Charleston, louder in some ways, freer in others, its streets alive with voices that did not automatically lower when a white man passed. And I learned quickly that freedom required a different kind of listening, one that did not assume danger but did not forget it either. I found work with blind children in a small school supported by the free black community, and teaching them forced me to confront my own story in pieces I had never named. When I taught a boy to count his steps, or a girl to trust the information her hands gave her, I felt the weight of every moment I had survived pressing into something useful at last. I married James Washington, a carpenter whose hands spoke of patience and precision, and we built a life that felt ordinary in ways I had never known were possible. Yet even then, even with children asleep down the hall and a house that answered only to us, the past did not loosen its grip entirely. There were nights when the smell of almonds would rise in my mind without warning. Nights when a raised male voice would tighten every muscle in my body before I could stop it. And I learned that justice does not erase memory. It only gives it a place to stand without crushing you. When I look back now, I do not tell myself that I was brave, because bravery suggests choice unburdened by consequence, and I had none. What I had was a narrow path between silence and death, and I walked it as carefully as I knew how, guided, not by sight but by the knowledge that some truths, once fully formed, will not let you rest until you speak them, no matter how dark the room or how high the cost. I am old now, or old enough to feel the years the way a house feels weather in its beams. And when people ask me what it was like to be the woman who brought down a wealthy man with nothing but her senses, I tell them that stories make it sound cleaner than it ever was, as if truth arrives whole and shining instead of inch by inch, dragging fear behind it. The truth is that even after Charleston, even after the rope did its work and the papers named me free, I carried Caldwell with me in ways I did not expect. In the reflex that made me catalogue every male footstep behind me, in the way my breath shortened whenever a voice dropped too low, in the nights when sleep would not come because my mind replayed the waiting, the months of knowing and saying nothing. The knowledge that Catherine had died, while I learned patience the way other people learn prayer. In Philadelphia, life moved forward whether I was ready or not, and raising children forced me to measure the past differently, to decide which lessons would keep them safe and which would only teach them fear. I taught them to listen carefully, but not to expect cruelty in every sound, to trust patterns but not to worship them, to understand that certainty is rare and honesty is harder and more necessary. People wrote about me then, abolitionists and lawyers and ministers who needed an example, and they smoothed my story into something neat, something that fit their arguments, leaving out the hesitation, the nights when doubt saved me from being reckless, the mornings when silence felt like a betrayal I could not wash off my hands. They wanted a symbol, not a woman who had peeled potatoes while a man poisoned his wife upstairs, who had weighed every breath against survival until the scale finally tipped. When I walked past courthouses later in life, I could hear echoes that did not belong to me alone, the scrape of boots, The hush before a verdict, and I understood that what changed that year was not just one man's fate, but a small crack in the wall people had built between whose senses counted and whose did not. And cracks are dangerous because they let in more than light. I never returned to Charleston, though invitations came, because some places ask too much of memory, and I had learned that healing does not require proving endurance again and again. Instead, I let the city live where it belonged, in the part of me that knows what quiet can hide and what patience can cost. If there is a lesson I will leave behind, it is not that blindness is strength, or that suffering refines us into something better, because both ideas flatter pain too much. It is that listening, true listening, to the world and to yourself demands humility, because it will tell you when you are wrong, and when waiting is not virtue but fear. And it will ask you to choose anyway. I did not see the world as others did, and that absence shaped me, but it did not spare me from responsibility, and if anything, it sharpened it, because when you cannot look away, when darkness forces you to attend to every sound and scent and shift in the air, you learn that truth does not announce itself with spectacle. It accumulates quietly until ignoring it becomes impossible. I am Esther Washington now, and I lived long enough to watch children I taught navigate streets without sight and without shame, to hear laws change slowly and unevenly, to know that progress arrives the way illness sometimes does, in fits and starts, never evenly distributed, never guaranteed. And if my story endures, I hope it does not because it flatters anyone's faith in justice, but because it remembers the cost of reaching for it. The long stretch of waiting in which fear and doubt argue with conscience, and the moment when a voice that has learned to survive by silence finally decides that speaking, even late, even imperfectly, is the only way left to breathe.